Hello, and welcome to my commentary on your Google Hangout 4 for a group consisting of Laura, Emily, Ubaldo, and Jesse. So first of all, I wanted to thank you for a good work, collaborative work this semester, since this was your final Google Hangout on air. And I enjoyed your exchanges. Your group seemed to not answer all the questions that were listed in the Hangouts. For example, in this latest one that I'm commenting on, you did not discuss the crisis communications and the analysis during the Ebola crisis. However, you had a very good flow of your discussions, and you covered the topics that you did select in a very collaborative and insightful way. So I wanted to thank you for that. So the first question that your group took upon was to talk about the interoperability of planning processes, and you had a discussion that Jesse kicked off on contingency planning and the importance of creating redundancies in contingency plans. I think my major goal on that question was to tease out the disconnect that existed at the Deepwater Horizon onset of the critical incident between the National Contingency Plan that was compiled or not revised since it was created, and the National Response Framework, because those two sort of coexisted during the Deepwater Horizon. As you know, the National Response Framework, as you know from your Homeland Security classes, that is the domestic incident management framework writ large that came out from Homeland Security Policy Directive, Homeland Security Presidential Directive 5. National Contingency Plan does not have certain mechanisms that NRF does, and specifically as it involves the Stafford Act and the function of security officer, and because the National Contingency Plan was in use and the governors of the states that were involved in Deepwater Horizon operated under National Response Framework, there was a disconnect there. So that was sort of a really important thing when we talk about the interoperability of for intelligence and information gathering processes. It is important that we crosswalk different frameworks and different plans, and certainly this was an incident that was offshore, and for that it seemed like that the National Response Framework was on one side and contingency plan on the other. And you did not touch on those issues, but you did touch on some of the other important things related to planning, specifically the fact that Emily talked about the lack of relevancy of emergency operation plans, and the fact that they were, as discussed in the report on the Deepwater Horizon, they were formulaic, they were using they were not updated. They were plans and wasn't really a planning process. So some of the people were who were listed on those plans were no longer there or no longer living, it was there was no evidence of the planning process, rubber or static documentation that was in place on a part of BP specifically. Ubaldo discussed the interoperability from a little bit different angle. Forgive my clocks, I don't know how to turn them off. So we're going to have those on the 15-minute intervals. Ubaldo talked about interoperability as a concept, and also between the private and public sector, which in this case, that was a huge interface. That was a critical incident that clearly demonstrated that the expertise in a domain, particularly the depth exploration for oil, was on the part of a private industry owner, whereas the expertise on the part part of the government institutions wasn't quite a par. And as you read through that report from the mineral services department, did not really have research arm or expertise arm to ensure compliance for years with the oil industry or proper compliance. And certainly it was not an equal player in decision making during the Deepwater Horizon, because that expertise was really on the private end and rested with the private. So those are very, very complex issues in Homeland Security enterprise and in Homeland Security intelligence operational environment, where you bring that private component into the public-private partnership. And Ubaldo, I think, underscored those. There was, of course, no synchrony between emergency operation planning and also the sort of tentative role of EPA and Coast Guard that sort of really relegated to, even though there was a unified command, the decision were sort of driven by the private operator. That certainly was problematic. Emily was talking about BP not heeding the emergency operation planning process and having conflicted priorities. And I think Laura was provided a really good picture on the fact that when we deal with land and we have offshore regulations and those jurisdictions that are, as I mentioned, part of the national response framework, have been working together, collaborating a little bit better. Once you move offshore, then you involve the Offshore Bureau, the U.S. Coast Guard, EPA, and those relationships seem to be fragmented and not they haven't been fostered, and they are fractured. So Ubaldo mentioned that, and I think Emily and Ubaldo talked to the effects of private companies being profit-driven, and certainly their priorities are on their assets and revenue production. So certainly BP having 80+ days spill in the Gulf was losing money, and was losing money from the start on the entire project. So so the bottom line, economic bottom line, is more prevalent when you're looking at that private part of a private-public relationship. Again, Laura discussed the fact of difficulty and complexity of having oversight of those less traditional environments where critical incidents can occur, like in this case. And certainly the private sector has accountability, but the oversight is lacking, and the oversight needs to be strengthened. So it's as much the government and the public institutions that are to blame for the critical incident in their weaker position, maybe to negotiate that oversight, particularly the way it was set up under the mineral services, where once the license was issued to the operator, there was very little ability to ensure compliance because of shortages of labor force and because of lack of expertise. And I think you had a really good discussion on that. Jesse was talking about the reactive approach on the part of the operator. In this case, I think you focused on BP, that again, following up in the same vein, that the major priority was to eliminate the optics of that event for that private operator. And I think you called it sweep it under the rug, which is, in this case, no pun intended, sweep it under the water, because as media were playing out that event, it was really, really bad image for the company. And certainly their preoccupation was to mitigate the perception people had about the event and how it looked, how it was being portrayed, how it looked environmentally when it was sitting on the surface of the water. So certainly, there are competing priorities, and thus the strategies applied to, and later the corrected use, were very, very directly linked to that. And if you look at BP, certainly one of your class discussions, I don't think it was your group, you talked about mechanical recovery of spilled oil is a preferred method in most of the European countries, particularly in the areas that are ecologically fragile. For example, the Baltic Sea zone. Gulf is, with the mangroves and fisheries, and, it is ecologically needs to be preserved and protected, yet we do have different principles or approaches, certainly in strategies how to collect the oil. There were different strategies that were being considered. The skimming, which would be a preferred method or acceptable method on the Baltic Sea, or in situ burning, which is a little bit more toxic because of the compounds and stuff it burns out. And then, of course, the most aggressive and the most unresearched and the most uncertain in consequences, high uncertainty about the risk, is the one with the dispersants. So, and Jesse said that, in a nutshell, you can say you can't really look at private sector or public sector not being to blame. That both parties were equally responsible for different reasons, one for oversight, the other one for the fact that they got away with poor planning. And I think Laura went back at some point and discussed the corporate issues of poor safety record for BP, and certainly historical record for BP of non-compliance or taking shortcuts on safety of their operations. So Texas City disaster being one of those with some casualties, one of the recent disasters and underscoring the poor safety record of Texas City. So cultural issues of a particular private partner in this particular response played a huge role as well in the way the politics of it transpired, in a way the collaborative forces were worked or didn't work in it. With respect to the question that I had for you about this integration of national response framework and a national contingency plan, so two federal frameworks that sort of were disjointed and not worked together during Deepwater Horizon. It's really important to note that if you do not have a safety officer, then certainly that function of a safety officer, as you studied in emergency management in your ICS courses, is to mitigate or ensure there are no unsafe practices with respect to first responders. That's the fundamental function of a safety officer, to include public health issues. And public health was not well integrated into the Deepwater Horizon response because there was no safety officer, because it was not under the Stafford Act framework and national response framework, the way the event was funded in the declaration of disaster. So this has consequences, or has had consequences for first responders, but also something that I don't think you discussed, the first responders being volunteers. And this was a huge issue in Deepwater Horizon in an effort, probably very well intentioned, of BP to sort of give some ability to earn a living to boat operators who are out of commission for the period of during a season of nearly 3 months. BP created a program called Vessels of Opportunity, where you could bring your own boat and participate in emergency response. Now, keep in mind, those were fishermen that suddenly became part of emergency response because there was no safety officer sort of component to that response, because the National Contingency Plan was invoked. Thus, all that voluntary force that was integrated into the response was not integrated with safeguards that would be there, or one would hope would be there, with that function of safety officer being present. That goes to awareness of hazards, proper protective equipment for those folks. Because certainly when you have economic factors and they all wanted to participate in that program because they couldn't, just sit without an income, there was a very exciting opportunity for them. Exciting is certainly an opportunity to compensate for economic losses, and yet they were vulnerable. And again, that safety officer function was really critical here. And because there was no mitigation processes or assessment processes or risk assessment processes for those volunteers, you can't really certainly create a causal research on that. Just very much like with Exxon Valdez, where as you don't know the baseline of the people that constituted that volunteer pool about their health, about their ability to breathe in those conditions, about their immune issues to start with, then you of course cannot study the impacts after, because you do not have a point of departure or comparison for the research. And that's, hopefully that is something that when you have that safety officer, you're going to be able to manage better, because it's all about the management of that force, volunteer force that now becomes part of the response. So from the interoperability, you moved into the equal partner in decision making, yes or no. And Jesse started by saying he wasn't really sure, but Emily, discussed about this priorities being economical for private sector. They have a tendency, or they will have a tendency, of course, for self-preservation to cut corners, and emergency operation planning or instituting those safe practices are time-consuming training, investing in it. So they might be more conscious about money saving versus, training needs. And still, because of that, they have different priorities. Jesse also discussed the fact that federal agencies have been, in a way, the enablers of the BP sort of taking over the decision-making during the Unified Incident Command because of the higher expertise. And Ubaldo discussed something about, in a unified command, you're supposed to be on the same page. That doesn't mean that you're necessarily an equal partner. So not equal, but based on, the expertise. And Laura, I think, brought out a very good point as well, that, those companies, chemical companies, exploration companies do not want, like her company, do not want that big scandal on their hands. They do not, they should be, and a lot of them are very safety driven, and they have created those positions, and they do have and follow the regulations. And certainly it's in their best interest to make sure that something like that doesn't happen. So it's not necessarily always that the economic issues and profit, is at the advantage of safety. And I think that's really important. But then, when you take that in perspective of BP specifically having a cultural history of poor safety record that, distinguishes in this event, distinguishes that company from maybe speaking generally about all public-private partnerships in the deep subsea oil exploration efforts. And I think that's very important to underscore, that that was a combination of factors here that led, cascading consequences. This kind of tragedy can happen to any company, but a company with poor safety record to start with certainly is going to be more challenged than a company that does invest and does put forth good practices, best practices, and make sure that they safeguard the safety of their employees. So BP ultimately, yes, almost went bankrupt. There's lawsuits that I think some of them are still ongoing, and certainly lost the confidence of the public because of that event. And I think Laura mentioned a CEO of BP who was certainly recalled from his position and did a pretty poor job of leadership and management. So it boils down not only to organizational culture, but also to leadership and who, is in charge of the event. So when you're talking about decision-making specifically in that unified format between public and private partnerships, certainly the personality characteristics, leadership characteristics are going to be impactful in determination, whether it's an equal partnership or whether there needs to be a lot more oversight on a public sector. And I thought you had a really good discussion on Jesse started a discussion on coastal impact, on environmental impacts, on cleanup, and the mitigation efforts, the actual impact for years to come, or recovery. And I think there was a really nice link because, we say that, the money spent up front on mitigation practices were certainly proper safety practices a part of, or being built into safety regulations and safety oversight being built into pre-planning saves a lot of money on the back end, and BP certainly had astronomical losses because of that event. But the losses were to BP. They were financial to the region. They were certainly social, economical, and environmental. So both the private and the public component were sort of hurt in a big way. I wasn't quite sure about the South Park reference, Jesse, but I'm glad that you were able to make a connection to other means of knowledge dissemination or intelligence and information. I thought it was really interesting. Question 3 was talking about the trust of affected communities in the areas affected by disaster, the ability to make decisions about life safety, proper protective equipment, specifically for first responders. Can the lack of that break the trust? And you relied on the video, and you relied on the certainly the issue of Hayward, and I think Laura discussed that. The refusal to acknowledge what was going on, the egos, the lack of collaboration and cooperation, the drive to hide the scope of a disaster and to hide it from public had huge consequences down the road. So we are coming at this from the aspect of transparency in crisis. And certainly we are talking, this is a class on intelligence and information management. Certainly how you manage the message, how you manage information here, and dissemination, so that that really important part that Loventhal talks about, it's often neglected, is really critical. And if you don't have good dissemination protocols, you can't get good feedback, and you cannot get good input, and that doesn't drive your requirements on the other end. And I think you touched on that. You talked talk about those community leaders that had a knowledge about the region, that had a knowledge about the ecosystem, that had a knowledge about the local capacities and capabilities and potential impacts. And even though they might have not been experts specifically in, knowing how to close the leak or, how to what strategies to use to mitigate the spill, they certainly could have had a lot of voice in other aspects of decision making and collaboration, and they were prevented from doing so. And that has eroded that trust in those communities that only 5 years earlier were economically impacted by Hurricane Katrina. So this is very important to keep in perspective as well, that this is a region that has been very sensitive in a way and vulnerable already, because the recovery from Katrina has not been full, if even partial. So those are already very vulnerable communities, and their voice should matter. And those were communities that already had high mistrust of how the government handled the previous event. Ubaldo was talking about, again, the environmental impact on those communities and the right to know what the possible consequences can be for fauna and flora, and for the agriculture and for the fisheries and for the, the agricultural sector or food industry in the region. I think the only part of this discussion that I was missing from you, and I mentioned it previously, was that the issue of first responders. First responders were not properly briefed about potential hazards, about potential consequences. There was a lot of practices during the response that, for example, the in situ burning that causes a lot of toxic fumes and stuff like that. So the first responders, being those incorporated volunteers that were also being exposed to those elements. And that's very difficult to account for when you don't have proper protocols, when those government officials at the local level were not able to work with it. Private sector, A, because they came from two different frameworks, and B, because there was this lack of ability to engage the community, to make the community part of the decision-making process. And I think Jesse spoke to that quite a bit on that point. So with respect to question 4 that got kicked off by Laura on research on Corexit and precautionary principle. So certainly you talked about the uncertainties in those type of complex events cannot be controlled. And the precautionary principle, deals with the fact of how much risk is tolerable in conditions of unknown levels of harm. Emily talked about some research that was not heeded, or, at least controversial, or could have been explored. And I think, certainly events like that create the impetus for research, and that was certainly the case of Exxon Valdez. But then, the funding and the policy will and the political will sort of dissipate over the years, and that type of research, sort of gets pushed to the side. And also, as research is very difficult with events that are so complex that can involve the multitude of variables. But short of convincing research, when in doubt, so to speak, that precautionary principle with respect to oil exploration and oil spills, it is binding in Europe, and particularly I mentioned the Baltic zone, for example. That certainly we operate at a high level of acceptable risk when we look at the Deepwater Horizon spill. EPA being part of the EPA and NALCO, this is again that issue of both in intelligence and national security, as well as homeland security and information sharing, there's this whole specter of proprietary, intellectual proprietary information. You discussed that at length with Apple and the FBI case on San Bernardino phone, the Nalco that produces Corexit and its proprietary recipe for it. It's another perfect example to where it's very difficult to do research when you have proprietary issues of intellectual property and the fear that those are going to be compromised. And for profit, you're going to have those issues of intellectual property. So now, how do you gauge the risk to the public? And those are very, very critical decisions. Certainly, EPA as a regulatory agency did not have the exact formula for Corexit because of those issues specifically. Now, keep in mind also that Nalco is located in Texas. It's it's the only company that makes Corexit, that type of Corexit that was used in Deepwater Horizon. So it's a very strong lobby in this area. There was a bill in legislature post Deepwater Horizon on taking the Corexit from the list of EPA-approved dispersant, and the bill got stuck. And initially it had a lot of lobbying for it, and it had not, to my knowledge, passed. So you talked about underfunding of capabilities for research, for being able to monitor. I think Laura specifically provided statistics on how many safety inspectors were allocated to how many facilities, and the numbers certainly point to those federal regulatory agencies being underfunded. But you didn't have on the matter, I thought, of Corexit itself, about what the specific research now indicates on it. You didn't really have a whole lot of information in your discussion. So you mostly talked about the fact that from the standpoint of precautionary principle, there was enough research to suggest that perhaps the use of that dispersant was excessive from the risk-taking standpoint. And I think that's, certainly those intellectual property rights come into question as well. You discussed on, so this generally formed a framework of your discussion on a Deepwater Horizon spill. I had a question there on Ebola, specifically on a dissemination, which is, again, that one before last loop of intelligence cycle, and comparison of intelligence process to surveillance in the Ebola tracking. And, I would have liked to see a little bit of that discussion, but you didn't go there. Notwithstanding, you got to the question number 6, which was looking at who was the best at deception in your group. And so there was some really interesting things that you shared. Of course, Ubaldo on his political affiliations, but it was really interesting to hear about your travel and soccer and being a member of military forces and so on and so forth. So I think that Ubaldo is not a very good liar, because I think you made him on the soccer versus football issue. So which was really interesting. Laura, I think you had a lot of back and forth on Laura as far as deception. She's pretty good. I think that's the clock again. I think you guessed her being in Iraq, you guessed her being a vegetarian, and you guessed her being living in Australia. And I don't know if anybody guessed her not liking the beach. Laura, you very much like my husband, who cannot stand the sand getting into anything. So Laura, I think Laura did pretty good on the deception. Jesse, the one with free guns wasn't that easy, was it? You actually only do own free guns, and you are a Colombian Hispanic, and you are a Marine. And so you actually were pretty good at deception. You know, I think the team had a hard time to nail your lie. And who else did we have? Emily. Emily, I don't think anybody guessed on you that you were not a dog person, and so you know, I think you might have had the most there, specifically on the fingernails issue. So, well, thank you for playing and sharing, and thank you for facilitating and taking turns on those, Ubaldo, Jesse, Laura, and Emily. I enjoyed your discussions. I know I still owe you the Google Hangout free, which I will record for you. You had a good session there on ethics. But I thank you for a good semester. I'm looking forward to your final exams. Cheers.